I think I've come around to the opinion that, among the opposition's backers, by the time they got to the point where they no longer wanted the opposition to win outright, where they were looking for some sort of middle way, then they'd already lost.
I'm Thanassis Cambanis. On this episode of TCF World, we invite Aron Lund, Sam Heller, and Michael Wahid Hanna to talk about the next phase in Syria.
Hi, I'm Sam Heller. I'm the angry-sounding one.
I'm Aron Lund.
And this is Michael Hanna.
So to begin, every time I speak to you guys lately about Syria, I end up hearing angry declamations about the mess that the U.S. is getting into in the southeast, and or sort of hand-wringing about the confusion in the northeast, where you've got Turkey and the U.S. and the Syrian government and the Iranians involved. And we could start with either of those places, but I'm wondering, actually, are those two things the most important locus of what's happening in Syria right now, or is it what the regime is doing in Damascus and Aleppo, where it has been busily reasserting itself since reconquering Aleppo in December?
What happens in regime territories is the most important thing. It's just that no one knows, because what Assad manages to do with Aleppo, for example, after retaking the eastern part of the city, if he can stabilize that and get things going and get people to return. Well,
so what's happened there? Because you wrote a bunch of things, Aron, right after December, and this seemed to be like a critical question. Can the regime actually reimpose the state in Aleppo after several years of it being half of it being broken away?
And my guess is that it can, because Aleppo is a city and it already controlled most of the city, and there are just these eastern neighborhoods that they're bombed out and people have fled and so on. But they can, you can roll out services and governance from the western half of the city into the eastern half, and that will take some time and it will be messy and so on. But
so did we
do that? It will be more difficult with the wider territory, I think.
Did we exaggerate the importance of rebel-held Aleppo while it existed? Was that the idea that there was half of Aleppo, or at some points more, that was in rebel hands? Was that actually a sort of a misread, or maybe even a willful misread of how much the rebels had managed to take?
Territorially they held not half, but I think somewhere in that vicinity. But in terms of population, I think they held maybe a tenth of the population toward the end.
Well, I would say two things. The move into Aleppo was a huge signifier for what the intentions of the rebels were, yes. Right? Taking a major city. And I think that obviously changed the dynamics of the war at an earlier stage. And even at that stage, I think lots of people thought this might be a mistake. This was overreach and might lead to a kind of escalation of violence that I think what ended up being true. And then the second part of that is whether it was exaggerated or not, in terms of how the international community and even the rebels themselves understood their position in the war. Losing Aleppo was a huge psychological blow and a really important symbolic victory for the regime. And since that time, the dynamics of the war have continued along that trajectory. So, point of fact, is it tactically significant? Maybe, but in terms of symbolic value, I think it is that important, and the way that we understand the war has changed dramatically since.
I agree with that. I'm not saying it wasn't important, but I'm saying I think after from 2016, basically, when the Russians had gone into the war and Aleppo was partly surrounded already that spring, I think it was pretty clear that there was no way the rebels could win that anymore. Okay, and from that point on, sort of.
But I think that I would agree that whatever at that point the kind of tactical significance of Aleppo's eastern neighborhoods was, then the political and symbolic blow of losing it has been something close to a death blow for the viability of the opposition to the Assad regime.
What about the obverse, though? Has the regime's success at taking the city back over, and crucially, if this is true, governing a Sunni population? Because this is one of the implications of critics of the regime, is that they depopulate Sunni areas, but they can't actually take Sunni areas that at some point rose up in rebellion and keep the people in them while regaining control over them. And Aleppo seems to suggest, I don't know, this is my impression, that in fact, they can do it. Is that what they have done?
Again, I think it's a difference because Aleppo is part of a city, it's part of a system. The test, I think, will come when or if the regime moves deep into the Aleppo countryside, I think. And there was just an announcement from the Prime Minister of Syria who said that they've taken a decision to sort of roll back state structures into the southern eastern parts of the Aleppo province where the Islamic State had been. And we'll see how that works. And probably we won't know until much later, but I think that's where the real test comes.
I would be looking less at kind of a part flattened, largely depopulated half of this major urban center. And then I feel like the test is in some of these rural areas, whether it's in the Damascus countryside or in Idlib or the Aleppo countryside, and then whether these areas can ever properly be subdued or if they're going to remain essentially permanently restive. And basically no-go areas for loyalists or incompletely integrated in institutional and economic terms into the larger Syrian state and society. I think that remains still an open question.
I'm conflicted, and I think for maybe some of the same reasons that you are, in that there's too much we don't know about not just internal Syrian government decision making, but really just realities in places like Aleppo, even in places like Latakia that have been in government hands the whole time. We just don't know how many people live there, what level of water and electricity are actually making it into the cities, how many IDPs there really are. The government either doesn't provide data or provides sometimes data we know isn't true, and therefore we're at a loss. But I mean, my working hypothesis 3 years ago was that the government couldn't sustain the basic web of control over the population it governed, both in terms of services and in terms of security, and even negative security. I on my last reporting trip to Syria, had the impression that even the sort of apparatus of surveillance and the different Mukhabarat divisions that were in charge of policing dissent were just overstretched and understaffed and weren't capable capacity-wise of doing their job. Today, I'm not so sure of that. Today it seems that the state has made a comeback, and I'm really curious whether that process happens as quickly as its reverse. And an analytical assumption that I'm now questioning is that it takes much longer to reestablish state control or oppressive state control as it does to break it apart. And now I'm no longer so confident in my analytical assumptions there. And I think if we can ever really get access to government side Syria again, we would be able to maybe answer that question.
Well, and if we were thinking a few years ago, what dominated a lot of our discussions was manpower and manpower shortages, and the fact that the regime was unable to fight on multiple fronts. And when one front was committed to, other fronts in the rear always opened up. You saw this in Hanna and Aleppo and elsewhere. And the ability to sustain a military campaign without losing momentum and territory in other places, that seems to have changed in the regime's favor. And so I think it has made a difference in terms of the landscape of the war. The dynamics of fighting has shifted, and the regime is now able, it still suffers from manpower shortages, clearly, outside assistance remains, but they're able to focus resources in a way that perhaps didn't exist previously. We don't talk about manpower in the same way that we did several years ago.
So this raises two questions that I want to throw out at you guys. One, was it the committed, decisive foreign interventions of Iran and Russia that changed that resolved the manpower shortage? And if winning is all that matters for legitimacy, and it doesn't matter if the victory comes because some outside power gave you the people power or the resources to actually win it on the battlefield.
I mean, I think the first question is easy to answer. The Russian and Iranian support for the regime was decisive, I think, in turning the war. I'm not saying Assad would have lost or fallen or anything like that. He might have lost more territory, but But to get where he is now and to have this momentum that he has now, I think that was necessary. Without forgetting, of course, that developments of the opposition side have mattered as well, Turkey's shift and other things.
Although, I mean, I don't think that those can necessarily be disaggregated. Just because, it seems like the Russian intervention in particular did a lot to kind of scare out some of the opposition backers who might otherwise have provided more robust support, or even if they already had some second thoughts about elements within the opposition, that they were still committed to them. But I mean, after Russia came in, I think that there was a sense that took hold that this was essentially Russia's court now. Right. That this was their dominion, and then that has been the effective assumptions that people have proceeded on ever since.
Right. And I mean, the Turkish shift, for example, which I think was hugely important and underappreciated, actually.
The Americans too, though. Well, realistically, I mean, this is what it is. I mean, once that Russia steps in and you have this kind of great power, full-on commitment on behalf of the regime, then confronting them on behalf of a political project that you no longer really believe in is no longer viable. I mean, you can't do it. You can't justify that risk, or you can't kind of prioritize this front among your other various kind of equities that you have with Russia worldwide. And so what you have is that people acquiesce, in one form or another, to different degrees, to Russia's strategic dominance, and then they pursue some sort of accommodation with Russia. And then they, certainly that was the premise of diplomacy through 2016. It's what Turkey did with Euphrates Shield, and is now, apparently trying to duplicate with Astana. So now the way forward runs through Russia. I think it's something that people figured out relatively quickly. I think some of the discourse, some of the policy debate around this took a little longer to catch up, though.
Well, I think it also exposed flaws in the underlying assumptions of those supporting rebel groups, which was a policy of incremental escalation through proxies that sought to force a political shift on the part of the regime. And I think that over time it became clear that was likely untenable. With Russia's entrance into the war, it became clear that just maintaining that logic, even if it was flawed, became really impossible. And the assumptions of really very serious risks for, indeterminate gains. So the idea was there was a sweet spot of violence in which the regime would feel sufficiently threatened to come to a political settlement, but not so much that you might actually threaten the viability of the regime, because later in this war, nobody in the West really wanted to see regime change.
And I mean, I think that actually, I think that assumption, the idea that this could somehow, that violence could be calibrated in order to produce this kind of compromise political solution, I think it actually infuriates me. It makes me so mad.
And yet I believe that. But go on.
I would say I did believe it. I don't believe it anymore.
I think it's crazy, and I may write another angry thing to this effect, but basically I think I've come around to the opinion that among the opposition's backers, by the time they got to the point where they no longer wanted the opposition to win outright, where they were looking for some sort of middle way, then they'd already lost.
Yeah,
this was no longer a winning. This was no longer a winning proposition, and then nothing made sense anymore.
When there was no alternative, then you're stuck. Well, but I mean, I think this idea it's gone through several phases. First, you had the idea that you could put pressure on the regime, and then it would somehow give up Assad. Then you had the idea that you could put pressure on Assad, and then sort of he would negotiate himself out of power smoothly somehow. And then you had the idea that when Russia came in, that became impossible. But then the idea mutated and became that if you put enough pressure on Assad, then Russia will push him out of power.
So looking at what's happened since Trump's taken power, some events have tested some of these hypotheses. So continue talking, but bring up the shooting down of the Syrian government plane, bring up the clashes and near clashes between U.S. and partner groups against Iranian and Syrian regime partner groups in the East, because these were the things that were supposedly going to either cause World War III in the catastrophist view, or that were going to supposedly force the regime to completely change its approach in the utopian optimist view, which neither of those outcomes happened. So what did those things achieve, and what do we learn from them about these hypotheses you have
But first off, I would say the catastrophist view of this is a straw man, and it's something that has been used by pro-intervention voices to suggest that because it didn't happen in this case, this argument that has been made over and over again is invalid. And it's just logically flawed. It's different also, a regime fighter as opposed to a Russian fighter jet. To conflate all that based on one incident, I think is slightly silly. But that's my pet peeve on that point. The other big issue, and it's one that we don't really know, is what is the intent behind all of this? And part of this is the really unprecedented devolution of authorities to military commanders on the ground. So were these tactical decisions based on tactical considerations?
You mean by the West or by the...
By the West.
Okay.
By the West. I mean, was this in fact simply force protection?
Yeah, I mean, that seems to have been
my understanding is...
And that's a very different thing than taking a kind of concerted strategic shift that says the United States is now going to fight the regime and its backers over this territory, and we are in the process of beginning rollback.
I mean, fundamentally, I think it's different things, because pushing Assad out of power means ending the regime as it is the regime now. Keeping it out of a certain territory or punishing use of chemical weapons, those are also things that the regime will be upset by. But I mean that it's not an existential issue. That can be sort of they can respond to that in various ways, but it's not the same thing.
I mean, there's huge differences in terms of scale and intent, and then how the latest skirmishes, I think, or kind of clashes, whatever, have been communicated to the other side. I mean, I view the static that's happened around Thanassis, the downing of the Syrian jet around Tabqa. I mean, all these things are risky and potentially problematic, but I view them as of a piece with the Sha'irat missile strikes. In that, I mean, these were, they were limited, specific things. They were communicated relatively clearly to the other side in ways that were designed to demonstrate that this was not a menace or a deliberate menace to Russia in particular, and were not aimed at regime change. They did not threaten regime survival. I think that if you were to somehow try to impose a no-fly zone over the entirety of the country, or to some of the more wild stuff that was in circulation in late 2016, I think that would have engendered a radically different response. It's a super different thing.
Well, so the Iranian and regime narrative of the last few months was that the United States and its allies were desperately hanging on to this last redoubt in the eastern desert as a way of keeping some kind of physical block between Iraq and Syria, and that this was the last-ditch effort for relevance by the West, and that it was foiled by the willingness of Iran and the Syrian government and their Iraqi militia supporters to march forward and do battle around Tanf and prove that they were more committed to this than the U.S. Now, it's clear and observably true that they're much more committed to this than the West and its allies. That, I think, that is not in dispute. The question is, was that sort of an accident that then played into a good Iranian narrative, or was there actually a desire by the Trump administration and some of its allies to minimize the sort of final stage advance of the regime, and they bungled it tactically? Like, were they there trying to, with the assumption that by having American special forces and proxies in the eastern desert, that the Iranians and the Syrian government would stay away and they could slow down a regime victory and look relevant, and then they just completely miscalculated? Or was that not their intention at all, and they got played in a propaganda way?
Well, so I think there's several important points here. I think the first thing I would point to is the question of perception and how difficult it is to manage the other side's perceptions of your actions when you are using coercive violence. And so, part of the risk of escalation is not necessarily the issue of clear and coherent messaging on the part of the West. It's how those things are internalized by the other side. And so escalation risks, for me, have oftentimes been about mistakes and mistaken perceptions. And that's something that I think we overestimate the ability to control. And mistakes on the front lines in response to U.S. actions can lead to inadvertent escalation. Anytime you have kinetic contact between the United States and Iranian-backed forces or regime-backed forces, that can be dangerous. We can't always control that kind of escalation cleanly and be sure that it won't become something more just because that's the way it happened then. And at the level of propaganda, of course, this really looks excellent in terms of the Iranian regime narrative about what has happened there. It seems unlikely that narrative is hews close to the truth, but it fits their narrative very cleanly.
My understanding of what happened there, around so you had two Western projects that were distinct, but that converged in a way that was kind of menacing to the regime and its allies. So what you had was a TENF itself, in which, as far as I know, was premised on the idea that it would not come into contact with the regime. The regime had no serious intent of pushing further east, and that so, some of the Western countries, for example, that were participating in TENF, that had special forces there that were training this counter-ISIL force, they were doing so on the assumption that they would not come up against the regime, which they did not want to fight. And so this was a shared, mistaken understanding. And then adjacent to that, you had FSA that were linked to a covert program run out of Jordan that were taking an increasingly large section of territory north of Tanf and threatening to link back up into the eastern Qalamun in a way that would have posed a serious threat and a problem to the regime. And so these two things together, it seems like it provoked the regime and then its Iranian ally and their various kind of proxy appendages to take action and to frustrate this in a way that I don't think anyone understood was coming or was possible. And then they did that in relatively short order. I don't know if it's tactical or strategic brilliance, but it looks smart, and then it's smart in that it was paired with, it was part of what they did in Astana. So it was the Astana and the way that they froze all these Western fronts that freed up the forces that allowed them to do this. And then it was because of, seemingly because of what was happening in Qalamun and Tanf, that they had the urgency to motivate them to do that, and then to finally enter this space and then ruin what could have been, a Western project.
Still, of course, the U.S. and others could sort of push around that if they really wanted to. But I think the thing here is the U.S. does not want this as much as the regime does, and they tested that and they've come to that conclusion. And maybe I don't know how you know more about what is being said in Washington about this, but I think the regime tested this, and they also, they would ideally have wanted Tanaf back. They pushed, and the U.S. sort of stood up for the zone they'd created there, and they didn't get it, and they still hope to get it because they need that road to Baghdad.
It's an incredible victory.
No, but that's not what I'm saying. They're trying different things. Some of them work, some of them don't. Most of this work, but not all of it.
Well, and one thing I think that has happened is that it has clarified U.S. intent. The signals coming out from particularly DOD after this suggested a very focused fight, an ISIS focus, and some of these more extraneous commitments seem to have fallen away, whether that was the original intent, whether that is in response to countermeasures by the regime and its backers, is somewhat immaterial, but it does seem to have clarified what the U.S. is doing there now and in the near-term future.
Yeah, I mean, the possibility that 10th could have been used as a launching pad to block this land bridge, to somehow occupy, Deir ez-Zor in a way that would frustrate Iranian access from Iraq. I think it seems like the Iranians and the regime took it seriously enough to deliberately frustrate it, but, because of when they launched this blocking maneuver, the discussion that had been kind of circulating about this in kind of the American commentariat and press, it was unreal, because this force didn't exist, certainly not on the kind of scale that really could have run this race, that could have mounted a challenge here. And then so this was entirely, it was imaginary. But then, after they did this, then it put the nail in that, like it was done.
So in some sense, the regime may have acted in some part, at least, provoked by the debate that was coming out of Washington at that point, where people were sort of suggesting this idea, even though it wasn't.
Well, people were projecting something that was very ambitious and had, fit into a larger kind of regional strategic context. And then, at least as far as I know, it was not doable. You did not have that force. There was no indication that it could have been expanded or built up into something of that kind of scale and capability.
But it gets back to this point, and I think it's very important, the difficulty in managing perceptions. So if, in fact, DOD had one set of intentions and these different voices coming out of the commentariat in Washington blurred that picture, it's important. It tells us how things that we think maybe are clear and should be clear are not always going to be clear in terms of how the other side sees it.
Well, thanks for listening to this edition of the Century Foundation's Foreign Policy Podcast. I'm Thanassis Cambanis.
Hi, Sam Heller.
Aron Lund.
And Michael Hanna.
TCF World has been brought to you by the Century Foundation, a progressive public policy think tank that seeks to foster opportunity, reduce inequality, and promote security at home and abroad. For more information about Century's work, please visit tcf.org or follow us on Twitter and Facebook.